If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you the most brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton. The English privateer or pirate, depending on whether you're English or Spanish, Sir Francis Drake was led to the spot by freed African slaves. They'd escaped from Spanish captivity, and they were now fighting a guerrilla war against their erstwhile owners from the camps deep in the jungles of South America. The Englishmen and the formerly enslaved people had made common court, and they had decided to fight the hated Spanish by severing the most important artery in the mighty Spanish Empire. And that was the mule path that led from the Pacific to the Caribbean across the Isthmus of Panama. The year was 1572. Drake had realized pretty early on the importance of this overland route. Essentially, the Spanish Empire worked like this. Ships came north along the Pacific coast of South America from Peru. Those ships carried the treasure of the Inca, but also enormous amounts of silver mined from Mount Potosí in what is now Bolivia. They arrived on the Pacific coast of Panama, and that cargo then got loaded onto mules to make the short journey across the other side of the isthmus to the Caribbean Sea, where it was loaded again onto ships that then headed off to Spain to enrich the Spanish court in Madrid. The idea of all that cargo going south from Peru right the way around the bottom of South America was just impossible. Savage conditions, very difficult navigation, contrary winds, vast distances. This was a much better solution. On one of Drake's expeditions, one of his African comrades took him to a lookout that they had carved into a great tree, where he climbed to the top, and for the first time in his life, he gazed upon the Pacific Ocean, a sight that only a handful of Englishmen had ever seen before. At that precise moment, he hatched the dream of taking the first English ships into the Pacific Ocean, and then he turned the other way, and just over his shoulder, he saw the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean. It was then that he realized how narrow that isthmus really was, and it was obvious that trying to gouge a canal across that neck of land, just some 50 miles distant, would speed up international trade. It would make it much easier to carry vast cargoes from sea to sea with far less friction, and it would make it more secure as well. It would protect cargoes from angry former slavers, bands of pirates, and, ironically, captains just like Drake. And that dream finally became a reality in the earlier 20th century. The Americans made that dream happen after some false starts, and in this podcast, I'm going to tell you that incredible story. This is a fascinating piece of history, but it's also now relevant because President Donald Trump has reiterated his desire for the US to take the Panama Canal back, which is kind of akin to a child who gave a gift at a birthday party and is now pitching a tantrum to his mother to take it back from the friend that he's just given it to. And he's also made noises of buying Greenland. And bear with me in this episode because there is some method behind his madness. Trump has also talked about their importance for American national security, but effectively he's tapping into something far deeper, something distinct in the history of American politics. And this urge to control the canal goes all the way back to the decision to build the canal itself. Let me start, though, by telling you a little bit of the geography before we jump right into the history. The Isthmus of Panama is such a fascinating spot. It's where the North and South Americas meet, and this has actually made it a geopolitical issue for centuries, and it remains so today. Before the idea of a canal, everything heavy, trade goods and the like, they had to go by sea, and this was a very long sea journey. And of course, the idea of building a canal goes back centuries because until we had that, ships had to go all the way down through Cape Horn or the Drake Passage at the tip of South America. So from the 16th century onwards, people kind of realized that if they could build a canal, they'd be able to cut that distance by roughly 8,000 miles and save weeks, if not months, of travel. So the economic, the geopolitical consequences of that were absolutely massive. So American involvement. Let's go all the way back. That isthmus was originally a vital artery of Spanish trade. The treasures of Peru coming across up the Pacific coast were then carried across the isthmus and then carried across the North Atlantic. And it was obvious to explorers and politicians alike that it could be prime real estate for a canal. And even before people began thinking about the canal, it was the site of a railroad. In the mid-19th century, the first transcontinental railroad was built across the Isthmus of Panama. The gold rush in California actually generated interest in finding a way to speed up the traffic. So ships would actually come to the eastern side of what became Panama at that time. And keep in mind, it was still the Republic of Colombia at this stage. They would then unload their goods, travel by train across the isthmus to the Pacific Ocean, and then up to California. So that traffic really intensified the thinking that even better than a railroad would be a water canal for moving goods, for moving personnel, and for trade. So I mentioned the gold rush in California, but that is what's kind of strange about the Panama Canal. It's not in the US, but it seems to be very calibrated to what is actually happening in the United States. Certainly the dream of a canal on the Isthmus of Panama was a global dream. You know, the Emperor of Spain was actually talking about it in the 16th century. And the French made the first attempt in 1881 to 1889 under Ferdinand de Lesseps. And that effort failed very dramatically. You know, the French actually underestimated the challenges that would be involved, and they were felled by massive disease and huge cost in life. And finally, when the French effort failed, the corruption and the final troubles of it all nearly collapsed the French government. So, yeah, there's been global interest in this area for a very long time. And all that global interest and the failure of the French really only kind of intensified the American interest in building the canal because it gave the US under President Theodore Roosevelt the opportunity to kind of use it as a way to prove that the United States was a remarkable global power and it could actually do what Europe could not. And this was the most important thing to Roosevelt. Before we leave de Lesseps, he actually had an extraordinary career. He struck the first pickaxe blow in the construction of the Suez Canal that joins the Mediterranean to the Red Sea in the 1850s. So he was actually on a bit of a roll. He was the guy to go to. And he should have known what he was doing, but for some reason, the jungles of Panama were just too much, what with the tropical diseases and the geology. But the French actually failed, not just because of that. They failed because of so many other different reasons. De Lesseps himself, by the time he tackled the canal in Panama, was a rather old man, and he actually didn't have much of a hands-on role. Disease, as I mentioned, was a huge problem, and the French really didn't understand the cause of malaria and yellow fever, and they actually thought it was caused by bad air and not by mosquitoes. So they took no protective measures whatsoever. And of course, there was stagnant water everywhere that was breeding, mosquitoes in the trillions, and of course, spreading disease. And during their 9-year effort, about 22,000 people died. In addition, there were actually heaps of engineering problems too. And they tried to build a sea-level canal rather than a lock canal. And that was just so immensely more difficult than a lock canal. Having to dig through the continental divide to create a sea-level canal across something like 50 miles would have been a massive effort and a difficult thing for anybody. So rather than work sympathetically, smartly, with the contours, with the height of the land, they just tried to hack through. And of course, the higher the ground that they came across, the deeper they had to dig. And trying to keep it all at sea level is immeasurably difficult. The challenge is almost unsurpassed by anything that had been done there before. So Teddy Roosevelt is an extraordinary figure, and the canal to him was about America coming of age. It was about America's reputation. It was about America's power projection beyond its borders. Teddy Roosevelt was an extremely ambitious man, and he wanted above all to prove that America was a global power. And this for him was something about national pride. And it was also a kind of a masculinist thing. We need to take our rightful place. And having watched the French fail at this, there was nothing better than a project like the Panama Canal. It allowed him to project American power in a way that could be presented as a beneficent gift to world civilization, as a gift that also rested upon U.S. technological and medical and scientific and engineering excellence. It was actually custom made for what Teddy Roosevelt wanted the United States to become in the global eye. And I used the word gift before, but how does the canal actually work, especially given that we have, President Trump today talking about how the U.S. construction of the canal was a magnanimous gesture? How did he come to that? I think it's important to think about how the United States actually acquired the canal zone, though. Panama at that time, as I've mentioned, was part of the Republic of Colombia. Theodore Roosevelt wanted to build the canal and tried to negotiate a treaty with the Colombian government that would give him the right to do exactly that. They refused. They saw it as not a good deal for them. They saw it as an attack on their sovereignty. And keep in mind, it was just 90 years before that they had shaken the shackles of Spain. So they refused Roosevelt. And I think, frankly, they would have started the canal themselves, certainly within the next 20 or 30 years. So in return, an angry Roosevelt encouraged a group of Panamanians. They were in this less than well-off province of Colombia, and they had long kind of bridled under the control of the government. So Roosevelt encouraged them to revolt. He paid them massive sums of money to raise an army and then sent U.S. warships down to support their revolt. And this is really interesting, right? Because this is exactly what the CIA do now. And there's been countless books describing in detail how that process actually works. I mean, this is a rabbit hole that I really don't want to go down, but if you're interested in reading something a little bit further about that, have a look at Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. It's an incredibly good read, and it explains the process of what Theodore Roosevelt was about to go through. So effectively, the Colombians from the province of Panama, with U.S. backing, revolt, and the government of Colombia falls within a few days. Roosevelt's administration then immediately, while there was chaos, negotiate a treaty that gives the United States complete and permanent control over the canal zone. A massive strip of land, which pretty much cut away the heart of this new Republic of Panama. This also gave them the land about 5 miles on each side of the canal, and more importantly, the right to acquire more land if they wanted it. Effectively, this gave the Americans a colony in the newly formed Panama. The interesting thing, the sneaky part of the deal, is that this treaty was negotiated not with a new Panamanian government. It was negotiated with the man who had taken over the French effort to try and build the canal. So when the French government's efforts failed in 1889, this man, by the name of Philippe Barilla, created a private company that continued digging the canal. And his company stood to make a vast amount of money if the US could acquire the canal zone. And keep in mind also, this guy hadn't actually been in Panama himself for over 18 years, but he negotiated the treaty with the United States. Safer to do that when you think about it, right? Because the new Panamanian government would have said no for sure. And it was said that when the new president of Panama actually found out about the duplicity and the underhandedness of the deal, he actually fainted when he learned what had just been stolen from the very heart of this young republic. So the New York Times, for example, called this a national disgrace. completely dishonorable. And there was an outcry in Panama, of course, and in the United States at the sort of brazen imperialism and duplicity with which the United States had actually acquired the Canal Zone. So the United States then encouraged the separation of this province from Colombia, seeing that it was going through a process of kind of self-determination, very much like the young American Republic. And it buys this piece of paper of ownership from this digging company. So the very origins of the US Canal Project are mired in a pretty unethical and imperialistic land grab. I mean, there's no other word for it. That's exactly what it was. And it meant that at its very origin, the Republic of Panama had completely lost its sovereignty, had lost control over the heart of its own country, and the treaty that gave the United States permanent control over the Canal Zone also gave the United States the right to intervene militarily in the affairs of Panama. Can you imagine? To intervene politically, to seize more land if they wanted it, whenever it felt that it was needed for the canal project. So in multiple ways, really, the new republic was completely hamstrung. It effectively, from its inception, had been colonized. And of course, the only thing protecting the newly formed Panama from reabsorption into Colombia is the US. So Panama is now stuck between a rock and a hard place. So the Americans have secured this gigantic bit of real estate. They've got a puppet regime almost in this new country, and now the engineering begins. So it was a spectacular project, and the United States moves in aggressively and very efficiently to build an entirely new world on this Isthmus of Panama. You know, the Canal Zone becomes not only one of the most industrialized regions in the world in order to pull this off, but it becomes innovatively, medically, scientifically, technologically brilliant. And the United States government really takes care to make it feel, for the Americans who would play a key role as the skilled workers, the managers, and the officials, for them to try and make it feel like a civilized American world. So the United States has to build the entire infrastructure of civilization. They have to build hospitals, hotels, cafeterias, housing, and of course the labor force itself is extremely complex. So you have 5,000 or 6,000 Americans and a few Europeans and Canadians who are doing most of the management and the skilled labor. And then for the hard labor, for the really difficult and dangerous work, the United States imports tens of thousands of people of African descent from the Caribbean, especially the British Caribbean, Jamaica and Barbados. So at any one time, you might have between 40 and 60,000 people working to dig this new lock canal. And this is paid for by what we call a public-private partnership. This is the US government writing checks. And the cost of building the canal, it takes officially 10 years, but in fact it actually takes more like 15 years to finalize the build of the canal, because they're continually dealing with, landslides, etc. The cost is about $375 million, which is a huge amount back in the early 20th century. Translated into the money of today, that would be about $19 billion. And it formed a huge amount of the US government's GDP, perhaps as much as 5 or 6%. And of course, there was extraordinary water management. They put a system of locks in place so that they are actually controlling the water levels in the lakes. The idea is if you could move these vast ships through some of the biggest locks that had been created of all time, it was an absolutely engineering marvel, to be sure. There were locks at both ends of the canal, which raised the ships up, and that had them then moving through Lake Gatun, which is a human-made lake, the largest human-made lake in the world, and then lower them down again through locks at the other end of the canal. It was an incredible achievement. And let's just take a short break here and a message from our sponsor, and we'll be right back with the final story and a bit of a conclusion with regards to my thoughts on Greenland. Altidomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa, but they are much more than that. When you sign up with Orthodomus, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Orthodomus or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we're back. So in terms of their health and safety of the workers and the conditions, as I started this research, I guessed that there would be different pain conditions for different people doing different jobs and different skin colors. I mean, there had to be. The canal was, in terms of labor management, the United States actually relied upon a pretty rigid system of racial segregation, and it was the so-called silver and gold system. So the white skilled workers, most of them were Americans, were paid only in gold. And they received much better housing, much better food. They received 6 weeks paid vacation every year, free medical care, etc. And it was said to be at the time so wonderful for the white US workers that people actually worried it would convert them to socialism, actually, because they would learn the benefits of government ownership. So funny. For the silver workers, the so-called silver workers, the Afro-Caribbeans, they were paid very little, like 10 cents an hour. They received shabby housing, houses without screens on them, so that disease remained a huge problem, particularly malaria for the Caribbean workers, because mosquitoes were still roaming in their millions in particular parts of the zone. And of course, they were exposed to the most difficult work in the early stages especially, and they were the diggers and the dynamiters. So they were the ones exposed to premature dynamite explosions. And in some cases, 40 to 50 men might be killed with one premature explosion. One of the American eyewitnesses said the flesh of men flew in air like birds that day. So they were exposed to railroad accidents and also to disease. And pretty much every Caribbean worker who went home had either suffered from malaria at some point or dengue fever. And of course, many of them went home missing a limb or a finger, from accidents they'd faced during their work. During the French attempt to build the canal, the French lost about 20,000 men. The American attempt? The official U.S. estimate is about 5,600 people killed during its entire construction. That number is probably higher because men moved so often, they changed their name, and a lot of them actually moved out of government housing into Panama itself to get away from the government surveillance. But if we say 5,600, 99% of those deaths were Caribbean workers. Very few Americans died during its construction, and it's estimated maybe about 350 men. But keep in mind also, that's probably a better mortality rate than many industrial sites in the United States at the same time. So the canal was finished in 1914. And I then wondered if it had an immediate measurable effect, because this is also just as World War I is breaking out in Europe. And in America, there are actually many comparisons made to the difference between these two events. And there's a quote, and I'm paraphrasing because I'm not sure who said it, but it went something like, "The lights are going out in Europe just as the United States opens this spectacular scientific achievement." So what impact did it have? It certainly revolutionized global trade, absolutely. The United States benefited from it geopolitically, and it absolutely did ensure that the United States would be seen as an important global power. Over the decades, certainly by the second half of the 20th century, however, the United States was actually not paying a great deal of attention to the canal. It didn't make the United States a lot of money. There continued to be safety issues with it. And so overall, it remained, of course, important for global trade. I mean, anything, let's face it, anything that eliminates something like 8,000 miles of travel is going to be important. But in some ways, it didn't live up to the expectations that the US had for it. But by 1914, it's also the year of the railroad in North America. And most goods from the Midwest or from New England going out to California and vice versa, they would have used the railroads and it wouldn't have gone by ship. I mean, railroad travel, say, from the Midwest to California wouldn't be profoundly shaped. But we can see when we look at the conversations happening in the US at the time that there was very important, obvious, subtle rethinking of the entire geography of the United States because of the ways that the canal connected the US to Asia. And of course, that made trade with Asia, and certainly between Europe and Asia, very much easier. It also made the Western courts of the United States much more important. So yes, there was a more than negligible effect, to be sure. So the canal is being run by the US government until the United States signs a new treaty, finally in 1977, the Carter-Terreros treaties that set up to give Panama complete control over the canal as of December the 31st, 1999. And how this comes about is also kind of really interesting. Over the course of the decades that the United States controls the canal, there were certain tensions with the Panamanians, tensions which gradually grew much fiercer. You know, Panama is really bridling. It's increasingly feeling that it's a subordinate player and a colony of the United States, to be fair. And so the US makes a series of concessions to Panama. But in the 1960s, January 1964, riots break out over the role of the United States and its domination of Panama. By now, also, if you just think globally, you know, decolonization is happening at a rate of knots around the world. You know, the Suez Canal has been transferred from the British back to Egypt. And there's a feeling that domination like the United States had over Panama, you know, for all these years, the sacrificing of its sovereignty is unseemly and it has to change. And so all of these things kind of come together, you know, the tensions, the riots, the global wave of decolonization. And the American elites by the mid-1960s are very clear that the canal has to be transferred back to Panama. LBJ, you know, Lyndon B. Johnson, begins the negotiations. And these are then continued by Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. And finally, then completed by the great and recently passed Jimmy Carter in 1977. And I'm also quite certain that the Suez Canal episode, like the one that finally brought the curtain down on the Brits in the 1950s, is something that the US don't want to experience. I then wondered, though, if the decision was politically uncontroversial within the US at that point, or was it bipartisan with both parties, you know, pursuing the project? It's interesting. At the elite level, there was bipartisan consensus that this needed to happen, but politically, it was very difficult. You know, Ronald Reagan actually began campaigning, and he somewhat, I think without even realizing what he was doing, I think he raised the issue that the United States were about to lose the canal if steps weren't taken to, you know, halt the negotiations. And he found, to his surprise, this massive public response to what he was saying. And so he actually made it into a huge part of his campaign. And I think what was actually happening was that Roosevelt's kind of boosterism, you know, back in the early 20th century, had really helped to make the Panama Canal into this kind of everlasting symbol of American greatness. And America was not a selfish land-grabbing imperial power. It was a magnanimous power that used its scientific and engineering might to give gifts to the world. And I think what's interesting is that that mythology was so powerful that Reagan was able to actually tap into it. So at a political level, it was controversial and has remained so, as we can see in President Trump's recent comments. So Reagan campaigns on it, he stirs it up, and it's a useful issue for him. I then wondered if he actually did anything about it once he's in office, or is it then too late? I think that the issue helps Reagan defeat Carter for re-election, and it helps Reagan win the presidency. But of course, by the time he becomes president, the Carter-Terreros treaties have already been signed. And so the issue then kind of fades into the background. You know, the process of transfer begins immediately, and the United States begin training Panamanians to manage the entire canal. And the canal zone slowly starts to be dismantled, and so preparations are made. so that in 1999, Panama is ready to take control of the canal. And of course, as you can imagine, that moment, December 31st, 1999, is a huge moment in Panama's history. There's a huge celebration when literally for the first time in its history, it has achieved full sovereignty, full control over the Panama Canal. And in the years since, the Republic of Panama has proven itself to be, in fact, a fantastic manager of the canal. The Panama Canal under Panamanian management makes more money and has a better safety record than it did under the United States. Of course, as we moved into the 21st century, the canal itself began to be made obsolete as ships grew larger. And so in the 21st century, Panama, with overwhelming support from its population, created a special tax to build an expansion of the canal. An expansion that was very carefully designed to be more environmentally useful to expanded canal works by literally recycling its water. So overall, the Panama Canal has become a very important symbol of national pride in Panama and a very big part of its economic success. I then wondered why this issue has kind of bubbled to the surface again now. And I think that ever since the canal was transferred to Panama, there have been anxieties in the United States about other global powers having influence there, particularly China. And so I think Trump is able to instinctively build on that anxiety, which is what we've seen him do. And of course, there is the fact that the Chinese play a small role in supporting the canal. There are some Hong Kong subsidiaries that are managing, some of the ports. And China is actually funding the building of the new bridge. But certainly the Chinese government is not outwardly involved in managing the canal or has any power over the canal whatsoever. And I think some of it goes back to this sort of boosterism around the canal and its symbols as a tremendous gift of the United States to kind of world civilization. And it allows politicians like President Trump to tap into people's anxieties about what it actually meant when America lost the canal and what it could mean if another power actually had control there as well. I've actually been really surprised by Trump's new rhetoric because I always thought that one of his characteristics was that he tended to be more isolationist and refused to engage in foreign policy adventures. And I wonder if this new talk about Greenland and, Panama and Canada is partly coming from him realizing that the domestic problems he said he would solve immediately will, in fact, be impossible to solve. He has actually said since his election that it's hard to lower the price of eggs. And what I think he's trying to do is shift attention internally to some of the more bigger global issues. And on Greenland, just to be clear, Greenland is an independent region of Denmark. More than 80% of its land is covered in ice, but Trump's interest here goes beyond just acquiring land. It's about ensuring that the US control access to resources like rare earth minerals, oil and gas. And as the Arctic melts, new shipping sites and resource extraction sites are becoming more easily accessible. And for Trump, this is actually an opportunity to secure vital supplies for the US economy while limiting the influence of other global players, especially China and Russia, who are vying for dominance in that region. And here's the thing. According to an estimate, there are billions, literally hundreds of billions of dollars worth of lithium and graphite reserves available as the ice melts, which is an important part of electric batteries. So it's no coincidence that Musk and Trump are now best buddies. Quite plainly, Greenland is strategic to the US, and that interest cannot be overstated. The more control the US has over its neighbors, the more power it has in a world that seems to be growing increasingly competitive and unstable. And I think Trump's goal is pretty clear. He wants to go down in history where the US controls a continent where its dominance is unquestioned. Watch out, Canada, because I have a sneaky suspicion that you're about to be next. And I say this with all seriousness. Your sovereignty could now be at stake. Thanks for listening in, folks. It was great to chat to you again, and I will chat to you again next week. Bye for now.